on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We've heard a lot in the last few days about freeing, what I would describe as, and what my next guest I think would describe as freeing the COVID vaccine, making it available to other countries for manufacture on their own part rather than being dependent on the major drug companies. It's a health issue, it's a political issue, most of all it's a moral issue. So I'm looking forward to talking with my next guest about it. Merith Basey is executive director for North America of an organization entitled Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. And there is also a website you can access, I believe, she'll correct me, but I believe freethevaccine.org. So without any further ado, Merith Basey, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks, RJ. Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And I'm trying to figure out where to start because we record on Thursdays. We go to broadcast on Saturday. It's been kind of a fast moving picture. When I first talked to you about coming on the program, I thought we'd be talking about the pressure to get the U.S. government to release vaccine patent rights. And it sounds like, seeing is believing, but it sounds like that may happen. But maybe we should start here, Merith. What does it mean when we say we want to free the vaccine so that the entire world can access it?
Sure. So, the Free the Vaccine has sort of been this rallying cry for many organizations now around the world. And the idea is that currently the way that we make medicines, our biomedical R&D system, doesn't just allow for anyone everywhere to have access to a biomedical product like a vaccine that, say, is developed in the United States. There's things called intellectual property rights that prevent access for people.
Right.
And that's essentially the fundamental piece of what we've been fighting for, is to loosen those, relax those, get rid of them ultimately,
right.
So that other countries don't fear that they're going to be sued by massive corporations when they're trying to act on the vaccine.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. And we've been talking about it a lot on this show, as you can imagine. And to me, I always start with the artificiality of the assumptions we make, right? Which is the idea that we assume as a society that drug companies have a right to own these. We assume that drug companies are responsible for the creation of them. We assume that it is not psychopathic to deny drugs to people who are going to die or get very ill, because that's the system we've grown up with. And in this case, we assume that's okay, even if it means not only that millions of people are going to be exposed to this disease, but that new variants might develop that bring us down again. So all of this, and I guess one last, and then I'll turn it back to you. We assume that it's an act of generosity for the United States government to say, we're going to send 60 million doses, or even, we will, under certain negotiated conditions, loosen our restrictions on this patent. So, talk to me a little bit, if you would, about those assumptions.
Well, what we're trying to prevent in sort of two words is something that we've been talking about, is vaccine apartheid, right? We are trying to prevent people from dying from a disease that has already killed 3 million people around the world, over 560,000 Americans alone. Like the US, more people have died here than anywhere, although the numbers are going up dramatically in places like Brazil and India. There's over 3,000 deaths a day that are recorded. It's likely that there's many, many more that are unrecorded in India, similar numbers in Brazil. And yet corporations think that they have a right to still continue to profit enormously. So ultimately, I think that is the goal. It's about saving life, but it's also about revolutionizing, in a way, this patent system that is preventing access, preventing people from getting access to a vaccine or treatments or even the tests that were publicly funded. So in the US alone, we've spent $16 billion of taxpayer money on these drugs. This is not something that pharmaceutical corporations are pouring money into. It's actually the other way around. So what happened this week was actually a really significant sort of chess move in this game. And it's sort of like, it was a check on capitalism. It's a check on the power of corporations, the power of the pharmaceutical corporations and the lobbies that think that they own Washington in particular. So that was significant.
Well, that's all good news, but what is it that happened? Tell us.
Okay. So on Wednesday, we received the news. It was actually during a rally that we had on the National Mall here in Washington, D.C. And we were asking Joe Biden to keep his promise to essentially free the vaccine, to share the recipe, and support something called the TRIPS waiver. And the TRIPS waiver the TRIPS agreement is the trade-related sort of aspects of intellectual property. And obviously this has a lot of importance for access to medicine. And two countries, South Africa and India, from October have been gathering a coalition of other groups to support this waiver, which essentially means that they couldn't be sued by corporations if they wanted to make medicines to save their own people, which is crazy that this is even something that has to be negotiated. But it was an incredibly important chess move in the sense that the US government is a key player and was one of the major countries that was against the waiver. And so by sharing their support, it means that potentially it's not just a check on the pharmaceutical corporations in Washington to say, actually, we are not controlled by you. We are going to go our own way. We are going to try and lead and do the right thing. And it means that other countries now, perhaps more comfortably, can come out and say, actually, we support this waiver as well. Now, it is at this point somewhat symbolic, right? Because it's still just this promise. So we want President Biden to come through on this promise. But it was an incredible moment on Wednesday. There were over 20 organizations who'd come out for this rally to demand that this happen, to prevent vaccine apartheid. There were different speakers from different countries all around the world. And we got the news during the rally and we were able to announce, and people were very excited that this was a backtrack on the sort of US foreign policy that we've seen around access to medicines. And it could be critical in changing the way that the pandemic plays out now.
I have a couple shorter and long-term questions for you. I do like the recipe analogy a lot. Folksy, which always works. And it's like, all right, Julia Child, shut up or shut up. But so that's good. Now, as you say, forgive me for this, but I've been burned too many times, and I'm in New York, and I'm like, okay, what's the catch, right? Yeah. And as you said, it's largely symbolic. We have to see how it plays out. So I guess but it's as a symbol. Symbolism matters, right? And as a statement, it's great. And in a second, we'll talk about the long-term implications of the statement. But what happens? You mentioned you were doing you're in the midst of a demonstration when this was announced. Some of you were dressed as Care Bears.
Also true.
And is nothing sacred. But sharing is caring. But so you got this announcement. It must have been a wonderful moment. What happens now pragmatically? In other words, I think there are negotiations going on with other participants in the treaties, and the Europeans were told maybe a little bit more hard line. And I'm always thinking, well, is the government going to use the U.S. government
Yeah.
to use that as an excuse to, So what exactly should we be looking for, Merith Basey? I guess that's my question.
So I think, as I mentioned before, like you see this as a chess game. This was an incredibly important move, right? It was a check, and it means that other countries and corporations are going to have to respond. And what we saw, you're doing a good thing when you see the pharmaceutical industry, the pharma lobby come out and say they're very upset, they're very angry that this has happened, especially when you know that this waiver is being supported by Nobel laureates and sort of world leaders, and even 59% of the US public is behind this, right? What we want to see now is this being more than just sort of words, right? That this is supported, but the US alone, like that move alone, isn't enough for this to pass, right? So we need other countries within Europe to also back the waiver. But a few hours later, New Zealand came out and said that they were now changing their position, and even Bill Gates yesterday. He's not saying he supports a full waiver, a narrow waiver. They have not been an ally, the Gates Foundation.
Right. No, he's kind of been the Darth Vader of all of this in a way,
Yeah.
hasn't he? I mean, he's been, pushing the idea that we shouldn't waive these, So what's he doing now? I think probably he's got pressure to moderate his position at this point.
Yes, and I think it's the sort of if the tide is turning, and again, like there's a long way to go, and we still need to. This isn't the only thing, and it's not going to solve all of the problems, but it is a key move that could, it's a knock on the power of the pharmaceutical industry, I think, which is important, and that's at the heart of this, right? Is intellectual property or profit as well being at the heart of the current biomedical R&D system. What we want to see is something that is more people-centered, and the fact that now Bill Gates has suddenly had to say, oh, actually, I don't want to be entirely on the wrong side of history. Right. The fact that he's had to play his hand. I mean, he's had a tough week. I feel like, who knows, mate, we were wondering if that was the real reason whether Bill and Melinda decided to go their separate ways. But
so, God bless her. But Bill's going to be okay, though, just in case you're concerned. I think he's going to be.
I'm not worried about Bill. But I think, to quote sort of Frederick Douglass, right? Power concedes nothing without a demand. And that is that's what this has been about, is saying, like, there has been pressure, again, led by South Africa and India. And, US allies, the folks that were out on the mall on Wednesday, we are supporting it and uplifting their demands to say that, sharing is caring, Joe Biden, we need to do this. And if you want to be the player that you say America is back, you need to show the world that is true. And that you are not going to just fold to the pharmaceutical corporations and their approach, which has always been the way. And to your point earlier, I think the US, this is one move, right? But the US has also been part of the problem for decades in this sense. So it's like, okay, we should celebrate. It's important to celebrate victories and wins, but also let's not lose sight of the fact that the US still has a long way to go in terms of ensuring access to medicines, not just abroad. Like 1 in 3 people in this country couldn't afford their medicines before the COVID pandemic.
Right.
People have lost their jobs, their health insurance. People are worrying if they can pay their rent. We have a huge problem, which is at the heart of all of this, right? And the sort of capitalist approach to developing these medicines is really not the solution in the end. So I think we are very encouraged and will celebrate the Biden support of the TRIPS waiver, and we hope he will continue to move forward with that. But we also need to ramp up manufacturing here in the United States. I think ultimately we need more people making more vaccines that more people can have access to. And I should mention also, like, the US has been problematic when it, because we haven't been able to export because of the Defense Production Act. A lot of the materials that other countries needed to make these medicines. So, while this is a significant move, again, let's not lose sight of some of these other hurdles and barriers that the US has put in place over the last few months and years.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview. And I noticed, Merith, your voice got a little softer when you talked about like the capitalist dimension of this. You don't have to be shy about that. Trust me. In fact, the last, sort of segment, if you will, of our conversation, I wanted it to be, not necessarily focused on that word, but on the notion that going forward, assuming, God willing, this thing, we win this battle, and we know, South Africa, India, other countries are going through so much right now. So in the short term, maybe we can talk a little bit about what people can do in the activist front. But longer term, to me, it's a process of education or kind of perspective, the instilling of perspective that, this is not a rational or humane way to organize medical care. You wouldn't do it on a camping trip with your friends. You wouldn't say, well, I know how to fix your broken leg, but it's going to cost you. We just wouldn't do it that way. So, and on an international level, we wouldn't be subject to such an empathy misfire that we say, so I can't help you. You're in the next campground, right? So
Yeah.
I guess it's a two-part question, and we can break them up if you want. But the first part is, what should people be watching for and perhaps participating in on the activist front in the short term on this issue, and the longer term, maybe what should people be thinking about, envisioning? You get what I'm driving at, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think the last year, and we've seen the explosion worldwide as well of sort of the movement for Black lives, right? And access to medicines fundamentally is not just a moral issue, it's a racial justice issue, right? Because who would be the people who'd be most impacted? You take COVID, what COVID has done is sort of shone light on the entire system in terms of the way we make medicines. This is something that we've known in our movement for 20, 30 years, particularly since the HIV/AIDS crisis, right? But what we're seeing is, I think, more and more people are waking up to the fact that this isn't working. And who are those folks most effective? And the fact that in the US, we already had 20 times the risk of dying from COVID, despite having the most expensive healthcare system in the entire world. Those two things should not be going together. And then if our Black and brown friends and family members and colleagues and so on and so forth, 1 in 5 of those deaths have been from those communities, right? And that sort of just shows where the cracks are within that system. They're deeply ingrained, racist, and something that needs to be tackled from, at the heart of this problem, right? So I think the good thing is people can see that now, I think. But to your sort of point about, well, what do we do? I think what we've been trying to do with the Free the Vaccine campaign is take a lot of folks now in 30 different countries around the world and give them the skills and resources to understand how the system currently, quote unquote, works or is working, right? And the failures throughout, like the free market would say, well, this is just a market failure. No, it was set up intentionally this way, and it's set up around profit, but it doesn't have to be that way. And there are alternatives out there, and we can shift the system. And COVID has also done something else, which is like, we realize we do actually have to share. We have to, in this, not just the vaccine, but also in terms of the science, like ultimately, and the technology, the know-how, we're all on one planet. I think the lessons we're going to learn from COVID, if we don't learn them, like, they're going to continue to play out. There's going to be another pandemic, and then there's climate change, right? So like, if we can't collaborate, we can't work together, that's going to be our downfall. And I think the move towards a more open, transparent, collaborative system is at the heart of this. But we were asking folks in the US to call the president and say that, before it was like demand they support the TRIPS waiver, but also that they scale up production here in the United States so that we can make more vaccines. Like, that is one step. But the big revolutionary idea is about putting patient needs at the heart of this, and rather than profit. And universities, which is kind of the work that I do,
right.
I don't know if it's all part of this, but most of this research and development into the vaccine, right, and the treatments and the tests actually has happened on university campuses with
exactly. Yeah.
So we're already doing it. What's happening right now is we're just allowing pharmaceutical corporations to license from those universities and then decide or dictate the terms and conditions of who gets to access what when. And we can change that. And it doesn't actually require a law. Like, universities could make those changes. It could be an executive order as well. But there are some significant levers that we could pull that would actually revolutionize the way that we do R&D in this country and around the world.
I would think even professors and university medical departments and other research departments could say, as a matter of policy, we're going to put our research, anything we discover or develop is going to be online. It's going to be publicly available. Kind of global transparency of medical information.
You would think, right? And I think there is a law. This is something else we have worked on around transparency in clinical trials, right? We want to make sure that people, the trials aren't repeated, because if you have a negative outcome, you don't want that to be repeated in a trial that might impact patients, right, who have volunteered. But also, we want to make sure that we're being efficient with those funds. There was a law that passed in 2017 called the Final Rule, which says that all clinical trials within a certain category need to be registered and reported publicly. And even at the risk of $10,000 per day, per trial, universities were not doing it. And we put out a report and we managed to move a lot of them forward, which is exciting. But these are the shifts as well that actually may not seem as significant, but they have an impact on the whole system overall. But I will say universities have not been the allies that we would like them to be, right? So we have been pushing for over a year for universities to sign something called the Open COVID Pledge to support the World Health Organization's mechanism called the COVID Technology Access Pool. And not a single university in the world, despite their moral missions, has agreed yet to do this. Now, we're getting close with a few, but you would think when 560,000 of your fellow citizens in the US alone have passed from COVID, you'd think that there would be this moral and ethical obligation. And so this is where you see the power also of the pharmaceutical industry.
I would assume A, yes, you'd think, right? But B, I would assume that a lot of funding goes to university research from pharmaceutical companies, and they don't want to bite the hand that they think feeds them, right? Is that? I mean, I know you're.
I'm going to say yes and no. There's two things to this. So actually, the most amount of funding is coming from us, from the taxpayer via NIH, right? And via, but there is this sort of myth that there will be no innovation. This is what they always say. Oh, there'll be no innovation. But it's, the data doesn't suggest that at all. The public is funding, for even pre-COVID, $41 billion going from NIH to universities and publicly funded research institutes to do research, from basic research all the way through to clinical trials. And then it gets scooped up. And yes, there will be some financial agreement, of course, with those universities. But they should be able to dictate the price, because actually it's the pharmaceutical corporations who need the public money, not the other way around, because they're not doing the research.
Right.
Yeah, you know, so it's just this sort of, they've done such a good job with spin that we believe this myth.
And the absolutely, and the tangled nature of the relationships and interests is so important for people to understand. You know, I did a piece for The Nation a while back about the Zika vaccine,
Yes.
which the U.S. government paid Sanofi, the French company, a huge amount of money to develop. It seemed like a lot of money to me anyway, like
Yeah.
and in return said you can charge us whatever you want for it, and then you dig deeper and you find that the physician at NIH who was the project director then goes to Sanofi and gets this huge job. So you get that whole conflict, and active researchers working for the government also getting a percentage of the patents they develop, which is an incentive for them to ensure that drug companies do have the private patents and that they charge as much as possible. I mean, there's just we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think the thing is, though, when you look at it, we did there's some research driven by a lot of students at UAM that looked across 13 different countries at, you know, where the money was coming from and where it was going. And you can go, it's publicmedsforcovid.org. And this was where we've tracked all of the public funds, which universities, like, you go and take a look at that and see, like, how much money your local university is getting to do COVID research. And this is just COVID. But the challenge is, we also learned that, like, the University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which does a lot of important work in public health, they received $91 million public funds, just this one university, to do COVID research. There is not a single provision that protects access or affordability of the products that come out of that $91 million investment. So this is the challenge.
Right. It's a political challenge, right? To insist that that be included. One last thing before you go, Merith, Basey, which is, and I feel duty bound as a leftist to bring this up, because not only has the COVID pandemic exposed the enormous racism in our medical system, and not only has it exposed that a lot of the people who can't afford their own medicines have insurance, right? We think good insurance, but you know, I always go back to the teacher who died because she didn't, her out of pocket cost of Tamiflu a few years back was $120. She said, you know, I don't have $120. It's just the flu, and she died. You know, I mean, there's a lot of that. So even with quote unquote good insurance. But the third piece, I just do feel duty bound, in addition to the racism, is, you know, they haven't gotten much study, and maybe I'll write about it, but studies also showing that counties with the highest economic inequality have the greatest amount of a greater amount of COVID deaths too, meaning that our unjust economic system, this is amplifying how that kills people too, of all races.
Yes, and not just in this country, around the world. So where are the most COVID deaths? They're in the countries, you know, that the US and UK have historically exploited, right? We know that, and we're seeing that, you know, and you know, at the beginning of this show, you sort of mentioned this, but you know, it is this, if we carry in the system of sort of donating medicines, you know, it's a neo-colonialist approach to that solution. Governments should be able to make their own decisions about their own populations. It shouldn't be sort of the benevolence of the US or Europe. And that's, again, part of that message around freeing the vaccine. But I absolutely agree with you. But there is, you know, I think something shifted. We need to recognize that. And also the fact that if you went and took a look at the shares of Pfizer and a lot of these other corporations in the last couple of days, the fact that they tanked when this announcement was made, it tells you something about, you know, what they're being propped up by. and a lot of that,
Right.
of course, we know is public
Right, right. No, that's
fund.
a great point, and couldn't happen to nicer guys, and may there be more of it. But you're right, and I guess we'll end on this positive note. And then, Meredith, I'm going to ask you. I have a minute afterwards. There's something I'm working on where I'm going to ask you for some information soon,
Okay.
but on exactly all of this. But then that maybe, just maybe, something. I've been waiting for it, especially since COVID hit. That that a shift in understanding, something in the zeitgeist, if people still use that word, that for some like awareness to develop that what, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And to the extent that Joe Biden, for example, the day before he made the announcement, as you know, his people were kind of like saying, let's not get out of hand here.
Yeah.
And then he makes the announcement, and he is a weather vane in certain ways. And I don't say that necessarily pejoratively. I mean, politicians should be weather vanes.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, do you think it's possible that there is a shift in awareness beginning here?
I think, if the last year hasn't radicalized you in some way, you haven't been paying attention, right? And I think it feels revolutionary what is happening around the world. And I think, as we said, people are waking up. And I think more people are outraged. Like when you start looking at the support of individuals, right, around the world for these massive agreements like the TRIPS waiver, I think this is where we're seeing a shift. Like people have been waking up. We have a long way to go, but it feels like something is shifting and it's moving away. Capitalism is sort of on trial right now. And I think, and I hope, I have to believe in the work that we do that this is possible. And I think what we've shown, actually, what happened on Wednesday is what seemed impossible, to change the US government's stance, despite the pharmaceutical industry coming out against it. The fact that first step was made and people are supporting it is critical. And I hope that we will now continue to see a domino effect of other countries, nations, and individuals and corporations, including the Gates Foundation, to move in the right direction.
And we as activists and advocates, our job is to push that process along, right?
Yeah.
So thanks for your great work pushing that process along. Again, Merith Basey, and if you want to find her organization, she is Executive Director for North America of Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which as an acronym, UAEM, has too many vowels, but
yeah, not my choice, but hey, it is
you
it is
play
what it
that
is.
out, right? But you're doing great work, Merith. So thanks for that, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, RJ. Always a pleasure.
Same here. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.